kind of start with probably what's more my comfort zone, which is talking a bit about the many challenges we're dealing with in the woods and how people are thinking about addressing those, but really transition more broadly into this, some challenges we're dealing with as it relates to people's connections to the forest, people's connection to where their wood comes from, and people's connections to like the diverse values that both conserved unmanaged forests as well as actively well stewarded forests provide. And so I'm hoping that I can span a range of interests within the group, but really building from the fact that whether you're thinking about it socioeconomically, globally, from a political perspective, or just looking at some of the environmental changes we were talking about before the call got started, we're really dealing with a novel context in terms of how forests are changing, how our relationship with the forest is changing, and also how there are different pressures that are influencing our ability to do forest stewardship and importantly be responsible consumers of local products. And so I'll try to end with pretty big emphasis on that latter piece. So don't need to belabor this, given several introductions talked about wildfire. All of us were talking a little bit about fire being in places that we never would think of in the Northeast. But in general, when we look at trends in forest management and forest stewardship, most of us really view the novelty and the uncertainty of future change as kind of the prevailing motivation for a lot of how we're looking at both stand level, landscape level, regional level planning, and how do we actually adapt to those changes. And so, as I mentioned, I'm not a social scientist. I'm a silviculturist and forest ecologist, but I'm lucky to get to spend time with some social scientists that can talk to foresters and others and get a feel for not just what they're concerned with, but also, how are they approaching adaptation. And so we've been doing a series of interviews and surveys across the Lake States and Northeast, both understanding how people are adapting to change, but also trying to understand what are some of the primary changes the primary concerns that folks have around changing conditions. And so this is a recent survey we did of over 330 foresters from the Lake States to the Northeast, both rural and urban foresters, and asked them just generally what are their primary concerns as it relates to global change. And so the highest level of concern and the broadest level of agreement between urban and rural foresters is that particularly non-native insects and pathogens, as we all appreciate in the Northeast and Lake States, that we're a region that has a high density of these, and they can change the game, overnight. All of a sudden, a species you relied upon is going to be eliminated from that forest. It can create a lot of challenge. But as you move down this list, things like declining snowpack, increasing competition from non-natives, extreme precipitation. We were talking a little bit before the call about just like the Lake States, we got most of our rain and a couple of events, in the middle of July. And so these flashy events that really can affect infrastructure, as well as declining levels of regen, too many deer might be a link there. And then the direct impacts of climate change as well. And so you don't need a survey to highlight this, but that it highlights that there are a diversity of things that managers are grappling with. And this has really become central to how we approach stewardship. So if you were to work in the landscape where these folks are dealing with these uncertainties, a lot of the stewardship we do today, although some of it, some might say, resembles, aspects of what we did 10, 20 years ago, there's an underlying notion that we need to be doing things a bit differently to adapt to these changes, managing forests in ways that not only are sustaining diverse values, but also increasing resilience and increasing the adaptive pathways that forests might have to be able to change. And as an example, this map on the left is a snapshot of all of the adaptation demonstration sites that have been established in the Eastern US via the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science. And there are hundreds of examples of managers integrating climate change adaptation into on-the-ground actions spanning private, county, different federal agencies, NGOs, tribal nations. And in all these cases, really taking climate change adaptation and integrating it with the other objectives and values they're trying to balance within that landscape. And so what I think is important is that there's often this idea that everyone is on board with this notion that, we need to be kind of engaging with the forest in a way that is thinking about adaptation and in a way that actually is potentially supporting that forest to allow it to hopefully adapt and really provide those values into the future that we all rely upon today. And if you look at a lot of this on the ground, much of it often is taking forests that, like in the lake states, like in the Northeast, parts of the Southeast, parts of the West, that have been highly simplified, either by past historic intensive land use or suppression of fire or a shift in disturbance regime in general, and using silviculture, primarily ecological and adaptive silviculture, to restore, complexity both in structure and species composition, restore important processes like fire. Think about ways in which we diversify forests that might be vulnerable to change by, increasing the representation of non-host species. All of these general principles that we often, again, in a room of foresters and at a large forestry meeting might say, yeah, that makes perfect sense. We should do that on the ground. But what we find is that there's a different dynamic going on when we kind of shop these ideas outside of the forestry profession and outside of natural resource professionals. And not everybody is on board with this idea that, number one, we should be cutting trees and interacting with the forest in ways that steward it for change, as well as, that, in many cases, maybe the forest is best left alone, at least in someone's backyard. And so, as I mentioned, not a social scientist, but I'm lucky to rub elbows with them. And so this graph on the left is part of some work that Tessa McGann did, interviewing foresters in the northeastern US, both asking them what they viewed as the biggest challenges as it relates to forests, how they are adapting to those challenges, and then what some of the barriers to adaptation were, and solutions to those barriers. And so I recognize this is a lot of lines on this graph here, but so this column here represents the environmental challenges. So the height of the bar is the frequency of which foresters said that was a challenge. So in this case, changing precip, invasive plants, pests and pathogens really were the most commonly cited issues. And then these gray bars just connect to how they are adapting. So the thicker the gray bar, the more folks say they are adapting to invasive plants via invasive plant management. And so, given what I do professionally, if I look at how they are adapting to these challenges, I should take pride in that they view silviculture as the key to adapting to these challenges. And so, before I get too full of myself on that response, if I take it a step further and see, well, what are they viewing as the barriers to actually adapting? I don't see anywhere in this column that I need more science from Tony D'Amato on silvicultural prescriptions, right? It's really revolves around key barriers that have nothing to do with, information, and much more to do with both what does it cost. Again, those that work in the wildfire mitigation space know the cost and challenges sometimes of pulling that off. Are there markets even to do management in an area? Are there the labor force around to do this stewardship? But importantly, what we increasingly see is that public perception of management is actually a key barrier. We might know what we need to do, but we're not able to do that because there's pushback on the idea of actually managing forests. And we had a follow-up paper looking at this more specifically, where many managers were indicating that, we know as an agency, as organizations, what might be some good practices to put in place on the landscape, but public opposition to harvesting is going to limit our ability to do that. And so I think most of you recognize this is not a dynamic that's unique to the Northeast, but it's very much, unfortunately, has its origins with proforestation and some of those other movements that really has been brewing here in the Northeast as it relates to forest stewardship for over a decade, and creating some challenges as we think about, like, how do we adapt to change if we don't have that social license or the ability to go out there and do stewardship. And so what's challenging about all of this is when we think about forest management and forest stewardship and where we've come from, even 30 years ago, in terms of how we think about balancing diverse values, whether it's ecological services or cultural values, or just diverse ways of thinking about the forest and different worldviews, aesthetic values, recreational values, all those connections we have to the forest. When we get into thinking about forest management, no one really can go out there and say, we're just going to cut for wood, that we're so far beyond that mindset. And importantly, often really trying to balance so many diverse things in any of the stewardship we do. But what we've seen really is that people have gotten wise, thankfully, to forests being awesome. And importantly, to forests being awesome for carbon. But what that's done in many cases is caused that to be like the objective above all others that is used to justify how we do or do not manage forest ecosystems, and really gone back to almost an old way of thinking when we were about maximizing volume from forests, to now often using maximum carbon benefit as the primary way that we should be thinking about forest stewardship. And so all of us are aware of just how great forests are as natural climate solutions. And I'm not going to belittle that, as the climate urgency with climate change has evolved further and further, I can't belittle the urgency all of us are feeling to find like a solution to deal with this. But the challenge is that it really is creating this tension that we're seeing in terms of like what is the best management of a forest, and should we be putting one objective above all others? And just to, I guess, even point to some data from the scientific community, you can see, and I'm part of these papers, we are increasingly adding forest carbon as a key variable that we're looking at in understanding both the impacts of forest management as well as looking at it as a potential outcome that's important for solving the climate crisis. But what many of us have observed is that this carbon benefit has been used as kind of a large motivation for us not cutting trees, particularly locally and particularly on public lands, which in many cases is putting one objective above all others, and importantly, possibly ignoring some of the external impacts of that via leakage that I'll get to in a moment. So I'm going to talk about a couple of simple examples of where there are some just general trade-offs in this idea of maximizing carbon benefit relative to other things that we want to manage for, and then get into kind of the crux of what we've been working on that looks more at this in terms of how we use wood and how we might be able to balance that from a regional perspective in the Northeast. So a simple example of why just maximizing carbon everywhere might not work well is that anybody that is a student of wildlife biology knows you can't manage for every species in every place all the time, right? Species have a diversity of values and habitats they need. And so a very simple example here, what I've done is taken the habitat needs of some bird species from the Central Appalachian region and essentially translated the basal area values they like in terms of forest structure into the live tree carbon stocking of the habitats that they exist within. So again, many on this call are way more versed in birding than I am, but we have several species like yellow-breasted chats, chestnut-spotted warblers, blue-winged warblers that really are associated with low carbon conditions, right? So basically, those species, if we're managing for their habitat conditions, we really can't be maximizing carbon stocks in those places. Likewise, we have a whole suite of species like wood thrush, black-throated green warbler, blue-headed vireo that really are associated with these high carbon stock conditions, and then a range of species that are found somewhat in between. And then also some of those species that use high carbon stock conditions will also forage in low carbon stock conditions. So it's a simple example, but really, if we're looking at even through biodiversity conservation perspective, we can't just be managing for maximum carbon benefit. We're gonna have some key trade-offs with species that we ethically are obligated to try to support there out in the landscape. I think the bigger issue is when we think about this in the context of adaptation. And again, many of you are thinking about this through, wildfire preparedness, trying to reduce wildfire risk, trying to think through, over time, how do we actually minimize, mass loss of carbon stocks through active stewardship and engagement across the landscape and across communities. But what we're finding right now is that there is a pushback against that, from some that say, the forest is fine left on its own. We want to kind of keep the foresters out of that land, and that forest will adapt, and evolve without any intervention, and we'll all be okay. And so what we see is this emphasis on, current maximization of above ground carbon stock. So we're just going to do nothing, and this forest is going to continue to accrue carbon. And that may be the case, for decades, depending on the situation you're dealing with. The camp that I certainly exist within is that, if I'm looking at a forest today, and that forest has some components that are vulnerable. Maybe it's all one age class, all one species, very low level of adaptability, potentially relative to what we think is on the horizon. I might go out there today and do some active stewardship that's going to reduce the carbon stocking, right? Within the forest, we're reducing the amount of carbon stocking that's out there. But what's critical is the idea is that over time, am I actually increasing the capacity of that forest to sustain carbon stocks within a level that we view as more desirable over the long run? And so we don't get this hypothesis tested until something shows up on the scene, whether it's a crazy sequence of weather that we're dealing with in the Northeast, or a new novel insect or disease, beech leaf disease, whatever next month's insect or disease is that comes in. And when that hits these ecosystems, that unmanaged system might actually be highly vulnerable and shift to a totally different state. Whereas the one in which we actually did active stewardship may respond to that and actually be able to sustain carbon benefits and values at a level that's above and beyond what no management provides. And so what's critical about both these scenarios is that this forest that wasn't managed, right, and now is transitioned into, buckthorn savanna or, reed canary grass prairie, whatever you name it, those are still very resilient ecosystems, but they no longer are supporting the values that we had for that forest, both in terms of carbon, likely in terms of aesthetics. And so a key piece of emphasis when we think of adaptation is that sometimes near-term carbon loss really is part of this bigger concept of carbon stewardship, where we're trying to really emphasize that long-term carbon stabilization and resilience versus this short-term carbon maximum and vulnerability. And I recognize, I'm speaking to an enlightened audience on this, but we're increasingly seeing this pushback that, we don't need to do anything as it relates to that forest and its adaptation. So where much of this, kind of ends up is really, thinking about not just the trade-off with can we do adaptation, can we support certain wildlife species, but fundamentally, we use a lot of wood. And so what we're seeing, and again, I mentioned it earlier, a lot of these movements have their roots in the Northeast, this idea of, maximizing local carbon benefit. But we're not thinking through, if I do that today and still consume wood at the same rate I'm doing, I'm obviously exporting that impact elsewhere. And what's interesting, and some of you might be familiar with this work, I certainly know Mike Snyder is, because I teach a class that Mike used to teach, and it's a required reading still for that class. But there was a paper published in 2002, actually led by an undergraduate student at the time at Harvard University, called The Illusion of Preservation, and Dave Kittredge from UMass and Dave Foster from Harvard Forest were on this as well. And this paper really looked at the state of Massachusetts as a case study and showcased that this is a state that at the time, and still to this day, really celebrates its stewardship and conservation of natural resources, but only produces 2% of the wood that it consumes. And so this idea, this illusion that, if you're kind of preserving locally but still consuming globally, are you truly having this great impact on conservation of that resource? And so again, even if Mike wasn't on the call and even if it wasn't recorded, I would give him credit for this. A couple of years ago, as these issues around proforestation and these issues around, really locking up local land for carbon, but not thinking about kind of the external impacts we're brewing. Mike was here for a meeting with Paul Catanzaro, and we kind of started talking about this dynamic with carbon, this kind of another kind of version of this illusion of preservation happening on a landscape. And so maybe this illusion of proforestation, local carbon preservation with global wood consumption. And those that haven't been following like some of the discourse in this region, and I think more broadly around this, a good kind of data point just to kind of give you a sense for like some of the mindset that's pervasive, even in the scientific community, is looking at the recent Climate Forestry Committee report from the state of Massachusetts. Those that might have followed this, there was a moratorium on harvesting on public lands in Massachusetts. They convened a committee that I was on to kind of review that and come out with some recommendations. And one of the summaries in this report actually is quite telling in terms of how folks are looking at things quite differently depending on where you're coming from on this. And this is a quote directly from that report. Committee opinion on wood production differed profoundly. That ... is my opinion that we should be, producing some wood in Massachusetts. But others argued that our forests are better suited for removing and storing carbon, and those elsewhere should produce Massachusetts needs. And so, 21 years later, this idea that, we should really rely on others to produce our wood, we should kind of lock up locally, obviously, in the lens of how we think about, environmental justice and equity and just owning our consumerism in general, pretty telling. So what this motivated was, can we look at this illusion of preservation again? How are we doing as a region in terms of producing wood relative to what we consume? And is there an opportunity for us to kind of balance this and be better both regional and global citizens as we think through how to address these different challenges? So I'm going to get into a study that we did, and really need to give credit to Caitlin Littlefield. She really led the charge in this report, and many of the slides and figures I'm going to show for the remainder really are from her work. But there was a group of us that convened to sort through, like, how are we doing as a region in terms of, wood consumption versus production, and how does this kind of reflect as we start thinking through balancing this need for carbon benefit while also still being, responsible global and local consumers of wood. So what we did to get at this question was spend a lot of time with the best available data sets, which when I say best just means, the ones that we felt the least amount of heartburn with, to try to evaluate, is our region actually producing as much wood as we consume? Those that don't think of our region as forested are actually, percentage-wise, the most forested region in the country. There's 2 acres of forest per every citizen in the Northeast, which is telling just given the population densities, right? So there's a lot of wood and a lot of forests in our region. And so what we want to look at is, current consumption, both of lumber, pulp, and fuel wood, how that compared to the production side of things, while also factoring in that we are obviously recovering some lumber through recycling, as well as recovering pulp and fuel wood from different processes. And so, like, what is our net balance? Are we completely solvent on this in terms of what we're consuming versus what we're producing? So here's where we are. The data that we use is from 2020, and so on the left is production, on the right is consumption. And the big picture takeaway is actually, a little more positive than we may have thought. 76% of what New England actually consumes is produced. It's not a one-for-one production, but there's an equal amount of harvesting and wood production, relative to some of these uses. And if we break this down, a pretty high proportion of our production is on the pulp side. Certainly there's saw log production happening as well. And then again, looking at kind of raw material consumption and lumber, a bit higher to paper and relative to lumber. But when we look at this within the region, and those that do know the constellation of our region might not be surprised that 70% of the production actually is coming from one state. Maine is producing over 300% more than they consume as a state. And so really carrying a lot of the production. New Hampshire and Vermont are more at parity with what they consume, whereas the southern New England states, those states that, again, you saw that quote, are ironically saying we shouldn't cut it all, we should rely on others, are already pretty close to that. So states like Massachusetts, only producing about 7% of what they consume, and Connecticut and Rhode Island even below that. And so much of the consumption coming from southern New England, and much of the production coming from elsewhere. As much as you want to pick on the current time period, it's always worth reflecting on history. And so I was digging into this old Greeley paper just to get better images of a different figure. Those that have ever seen those maps of historic extent of virgin forest, those came from a paper by Greeley, 1925. But he's got a bunch of other cool figures, including this one that shows lumber shortages and surpluses by state 100 years prior to us doing this analysis. And what he shows here is this region highlighted in red, basically is the area that cuts only 23% of the lumber they use, and they ship in 77%, chiefly from the South and from the far West. And so those that kind of know the history, right, a lot of those areas were pretty heavily cut over at that time period, whether it be Minnesota or the Northeast, and so really weren't in a position to be producing much lumber over large areas. But at the same time, we have huge population centers, et cetera, that are shipping in wood from elsewhere, kind of creating this historic imbalance. And so it's not something that's new, but in many cases, our landscapes changed dramatically since then. And so you would hope that we'd be a little bit better off than we were 100 years ago. So how do we actually rectify this? And so we generated this report. I'll have a link at the end that folks can look at, called Beyond the Illusion of Preservation. How do we move beyond this and actually produce as much as we consume as a region? And then I don't mean this to, belittle the importance of global markets and getting wood from all over the place. But if we really want to think about, a region that is so tied to the land, has this history of forest use and communities that are built around that, is there a way to actually produce as much as we consume in the Northeast? And so I'm going to go through the remainder of this. It's meant more to be a thought exercise than to get into granular numbers per se. This is really more just to hopefully get people thinking. But what does it take to actually pull this off? To as a reason be solvent on that. So there's 3 steps. I'll go through them briefly and then talk a little bit about what it looks like in terms of acreages, et cetera, to move beyond the illusion. So the first piece, those that aren't familiar with the ownership patterns in the Northeast, we are primarily owned by private lands. And so it's a very vulnerable landscape in terms of forest loss. And so the first step, if we want to actually maintain any forest benefits, let alone the ability to sustainably produce wood, is we need to protect more land through easements and other approaches to protecting private lands. And so what the report really advocates for is kind of doubling down on this wildlands and woodlands vision. Again, some of you might be familiar with that work that began in Massachusetts in 2004 and really kind of expanded to all of New England in 2010. That really advocates for working with this huge percentage of New England that's currently unprotected and increasing that over time to be a landscape that's 70% protected from development. And then a portion of that 10% being protected from all land use. So basically designated as wildlands, with the other 60% being designated as woodlands. So really trying to sustain that. Right now, like other regions, we've been celebrating this historic return to forests. So this graph on the right, many of you've seen, going from a highly forested condition at the time of European colonization to one that was fairly low in the mid 1800s to now having, again, percentage-wise, on the 3 most forested states, and even a state like Massachusetts, being over 60% forested. But the trend has been quite negative recently, losing close to 30,000 acres of forest per year. And that doesn't include, we've seen a lot of development post-COVID with folks kind of moving into different communities, building second homes, et cetera. And so I'm fearful what the next trend is going to be in terms of how much we're losing. And so trying to reverse that trend is just a first step in all of this. Second, and the one that, depending on audience can give some pause, is that we need to reduce how much we consume, and that's like, this could be a talk on, electronics or plastic. I mean, we just need to reduce what we consume. We consume so much as a society, and to be honest, don't own it, and so the beauty with forests and the ability to engage with forests is one of the few things that we use outside of the food we eat, that we can actually engage with the resource, and it's a very renewable resource as opposed to what's going into those electronics. And so to balance this, it's not just cutting more, importantly, it's in many cases reducing how much we actually need, and even thinking about just like the size of the average home, how much that's doubled in many cases over a 30-year period. Do we still need to be building as large as we're building, and should we be thinking more about multifamily housing, et cetera? Really has been the push for a lot of our region. Thankfully, we have Dovetail and all the work that you all do to think about ways in which we can build both affordable housing and do it in ways with materials that are carbon friendly. So really trying to think through, like, how do we meet housing needs, shift some of the paper consumption into more durable products, whether it be mass timber, wood insulation, substituting wood for plastic, all of these different substitutions that really are better for the environment, but nevertheless would still be kind of reducing overall how much wood we're consuming, just based on projections for housing, single family homes, et cetera, in the region, while also just improving what we do for recycling. It's pretty amazing just how much wood is wasted and not repurposed in this current day. Then the last piece, the one that you can imagine I'm biased towards, is that we need to, if we're going to be doing more management, really expand upon models of stewardship that tend to provide a diversity of values, really balancing the ecological and social and cultural values out there in the forest. And so using ecological forestry as a way to engage with the land and use our understanding of that ecosystem and its dynamics to really generate, certainly wood, but also many other values that we care about. And doing this in ways that really expand the acreage that's happening in the landscape, and trying to really shift more of what we're doing over time into lumber versus what's been pretty heavily focused on pulp and paper production. What I find is that some view that third step is almost in the front, that we've already been doing good stewardship. Why should we change like our models of management on those landscapes where we're seeing a lot of harvesting already occurring? But when we actually look at what's happening across the landscape where we are producing a lot of wood, the picture is not that great in terms of how we're approaching our silviculture writ large. And there was a recent paper by Ethan Belair and Mark Ducey that used FIA data. It's not the most perfect data source to quantify this, but to look at areas that have received some sort of forest harvesting over an FIA inventory cycle, and then classify those into different into different harvesting types. And so the light red are high grade, the dark red are commercial clear cut, and then the remaining shades are actually silviculture. And so if you look at the harvesting occurring across the region based on this snapshot, almost 50% of what's occurring is not even silviculture, right? It's a harvesting of wood, but if you would try to classify like what actually is happening there in terms of long-term outcome and investment, there's not a lot of evidence to suggest that we're really thinking through kind of future options in that stand. And so beyond thinking about ecological silviculture, we need to be thinking again about like our larger corporate lands, some of our other large ownerships where there's been this shift away from some of those key investments that are important, like pre-commercial thinning, release treatments, et cetera, to make sure we're maintaining the productive base out there in the landscape for future opportunities. So if we were to pull this off, right, and look into the future, 2060, who knows what the world's going to look like then, but let's at least hope we get our wood balance in the Northeast right. How much acreage is actually needed to pull this off in our region? And so we took a conservative, depending on where you are in the Northeast and depending on how you manage your forest, kind of growth rate per acre per year, 0.4 cords per acre per year, and kind of over time increase that proportion of that harvest towards saw logs, just based on assumptions around how different silvicultural regimes would generate kind of a higher proportion of that within the product mix. And then looked at how many acres are needed to produce the consumption that we project for 2060, and it ends up being like 20 million acres to meet those needs across the Northeast. How does that break down? It's 50% of public lands would be managed, 50% of family forests and NGO lands, and then 100% of corporate lands. And this is after taking out that 10% of the landscape for wildlands. This is kind of what it would take to have that regional net balance for production equal consumption. And so just to recap how that was achieved, so it wasn't just like cut to reach today's consumption levels. Again, we reduced consumption into the future by 25%. We increased that recovery component, particularly on the recycled content in paper, as well as wood reclamation, and then slightly reduced production, but really reoriented much of that more towards lumber and durable products. So what does that get us in 2060? Regional utopia, if you care about highly localized circular forest economy, where we have kind of this net balance, New England wide on the far left, so production kind of equal to consumption, obviously a higher proportion now in lumber relative to pulp. But then if we look at it state by state, again, Maine is still producing a large proportion. If you think about this in terms of sustaining what already exists in terms of rural communities and that workforce, and there's a lot of potential to sustain and grow that. Whereas states like Massachusetts, Connecticut, the bars might not look that impressive, but they have moved up 14 to 20% in what they're doing in terms of local production. And so really kind of balancing both how much we're using with consumption across the region. So just to compare where we're at versus where we could go, again, production on the left in 2020, production on the right in 2060, so a slight decrease. And the key difference being, both that reduction in consumption as well as an increase in how much we're reusing and recycling in those materials. So obviously this is aspirational, and in many cases just meant to hopefully be a point of reflection, as we think through these kind of state level, regional level, national level, approaches to how we apply natural climate solutions. We need to think through that, wood is awesome, forests are sustainably managed. We have tremendous oversight of these resources. And so how do we, not lose that? And how do we actually possibly up our game, particularly in places like the Northeast, where this is currently a major blind spot? And so one key piece to make this happen, similar to other parts of the country, our forest-based communities really are suffering. Many of our distressed counties in the Northeast overlap with those communities that have historically had a strong connection to forest-based industries. And so how do we reinvest in those areas, importantly, as new products are coming online? Again, thanks to Dovetail and others for kind of highlighting the importance of the evolution of the forest products we use as opportunities to prop these communities up, but it still needs kind of public investment and, importantly, policies that really value the production of goods locally for both community benefit, but also ecological benefit. At the same time, we tend to see here the biggest criticism in terms of management being lobbied at particularly national forests, but also some of our state lands that are exemplary models of stewardship, in our region, just in terms of how do we balance allocation of lands for different values, how do we manage in ways that are thinking through kind of a diversity of outcomes, and how do we do that in a way that's participatory and so that we have public input in the process. And so I am a major advocate for using public lands in particular as a model to inspire, like, how do we actually balance different approaches to stewardship across the landscape and use them as key anchors in landscapes that are primarily dominated by family forests and other ownerships. And so the last piece is the biggest challenge, is that getting family forest owners to actually engage more in active forest management and do it in ways that are really thinking about trying to balance and coordinate both ecological values, but also contributing to kind of regional wood baskets in ways that can sustain local communities and local economies. And so just to kind of highlight where this is, that the challenge of this last point, on the right is a map of a slice of Western Massachusetts. The green blobs are currently public lands. So those are lands where you might be able to think about reliably doing stewardship in kind of a balanced context. All those parcels delineate family forest ownership. And so I'd mentioned 50% of family forest owners would need to engage with some level of forest stewardship to meet that wood production need. That's a large percentage. And so really thinking through, and again, it's great to hear many on the call are engaged with community and forestry and engagement around different issues, like finding ways to better connect with landowners around like both the importance of keeping your forest, but also where possible contributing to kind of local consumptive needs. So I'll end with just a cartoon from the handout that I received as a forestry student from Bob Seymour when I was an undergrad at UMaine at the end of the semester, talking about this idea of how do we balance values across the landscape. Some of you are familiar with the concept of the triad. Really visionary. In 1992, he and Matt Hunter, as wildlife biologists, really thought about this idea of like, you can't manage for everything everywhere, so how about we allocate the landscape to different uses, and really thought through how do we protect areas as ecological reserves for biological diversity purposes. How do we offset that loss of production by maybe having some plantations that can grow wood at high rates so we can produce more from a limited area. And then in the middle, everything else would be managed with ecological forestry, kind of that. And to me, what inspired me to get into what I do, this idea that we can manage for many values and still, have biodiversity, forest products, as well as many of the things we value in the forest. But what we've seen is really this bifurcation, that we've kind of lost that middle ground to some degree, right? There's this idea, particularly in affluent regions, both of the US and then just as an affluent nation, where we can get wood from anywhere and not really think about where that comes from. There tends to be, this outsized reliance on both plantations, but also in many cases corporate lands that may or may not be, balancing the diverse values that we're thinking about from a wider landscape. And importantly, if we look at kind of the global balance in wood, almost 50% of our wood globally comes from plantations right now. So we really are relying on that land base to support our wood needs, which is great. But we also want to make sure that we're sharing some of that burden elsewhere and using that stewardship to get at these adaptive responses we talked about at the beginning, and many of you that you're interested in and through your work, that if we're not doing management anywhere else, like we're going to lose the ability to adapt and the ability to sustain many of the values out there. But I think that the key crux, and as much as I wish it was about like regenerating yellow birch and restoring complex conditions via silviculture, it really is about the public and policymakers and getting them to understand that management can be a positive thing in supporting values and supporting adaptation. And importantly, what I'm finding more and more is that like my voice is and those that have any linkage to forestry is not trusted. That there's somehow like my drawers are full of stacks of $100 bills, I guess, from industry to advocate for cutting trees. and that's fine. I'm being glib there, but we need more people to be talking about like why there's value in management, including when we think about like global equity, and where we're getting the materials we consume from. We need to be kind of thinking about what the impacts are of some of these policies that folks are advocating for. And so I appreciate Dovetail and all you do, to certainly be a trusted voice, in supporting this positive discourse, but we need more people to be thinking about how can we also celebrate the value of responsibly stewarded forest land, for diverse values, so we can move beyond the illusion. So I'll stop with that. Those that do need help sleeping, you can go to masswoods.org and you can download Beyond the Illusion of Preservation. Again, just a huge shout out to Caitlin Middlefield and Brian Donahue, who led this charge. But if you want to get into the numbers and kind of our assumptions, et cetera, there are some mind-numbing appendices in there. But I'm certainly happy to answer any questions before you all go to your main meeting.